Hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming to a seminar on really the last Wednesday of the year 2019. May it rest in peace. There's only sort of a couple of weeks to go for it. And really appreciate you coming along. It's a great opportunity we've had. Professor Sioshansi is from Ohio State University. We've known each other and collaborated a little on some aspects of market design and a few other things for quite some number of years now.
Mm-hmm.
And Ramteen was out here. He's been giving some plenaries down in Canberra at the Asia Pacific Research Conference and also over in Perth at ICPES, IEEE Conference, Power Conference. And we've been delighted to be able to have him here in Sydney for a little while as well. So we had a bit of a discussion as to what you might present. There's a range of things. I should say Ramteen works across a range of areas. Capacity expansion modelling, which is very relevant. You may know that the draft integrated system plan, next one's just come out. Also on interactions between gas and electricity markets, which is something that's very important here in Australia now. It used to not be, but now that we're linked with export LNG markets, we're seeing some really important and quite challenging interactions between our gas and electricity markets. But another area that Ramteen's worked in for quite a while is around storage, particularly utility storage. And so we thought that might be a good focus for today. If you want to chat to him about some of his other things, please do just come down afterwards. And he's got a couple more days here in Sydney, so there's a few things in his schedule, but if there's particular areas you'd like to explore his expertise, you're basically knowledge on tap for the next couple of days.
Exactly.
So please, just feel free to come down. So yeah, look, we're formally going to run till about 1. I think probably, around a 40-minute presentation, something like that. If there's questions of clarification, just jump in. But if there's more discussion style, let's sort of hold that to the end. We're not going to be driven out of here at 1 o'clock. So if the discussion keeps going, we can keep going as well. If you need to head off, that's fine too. But on that note, I'll ask you to join me in welcoming Ramteen and really look forward to your presentation.
Great. All right, well, thank you very much, Ian, for the invitation and for the introduction. I've actually been thinking the past few weeks how long we've actually known each other and when we first met, and it escapes me, so we'll have to kind of recreate that history. So what I'm planning on talking about is, and I have to apologize to some extent, it's a rather, I'd say, wonky market design topic having to do with energy storage. And it's something that we're contending with in the US, and I think to a large extent we haven't been doing a great job of dealing with the issues that I'm going to be talking about. So I think the state of Texas is probably the region of the United States that's kind of furthest along, at least recognizing the problems that I'm going to be talking about with respect to integrating energy storage into markets and then some of the regulatory issues that energy storage raise. So just an outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to very, very briefly go through just a quick summary of different types of things that energy storage can do. Then I'm going to talk briefly about how energy storage is incompatible with how we've done market and regulatory design in the United States the past 30 plus years that we've been doing market restructuring. And my understanding from conversations I've had with folks here is that some of these issues are kind of coming up in the Australian context as well. So hopefully this is not just a pure US focused discussion here. And then the third topic is really the kind of bulk of what I'm going to be talking about, which is this idea of using storage capacity rights as one potential solution to this regulatory and market design issue that I'm going to be talking about. So really quickly, what I have here is basically kind of 4 major bullets that kind of summarize the different things that we can do with energy storage. So it's basically energy arbitrage or generation shifting. Those are different terms depending on whether you're in in a wholesale market or if you're in a vertically integrated utility type context. Second one is capacity deferral. Third is ancillary services. And then fourth is end user applications. And more or less anything that you could imagine doing with energy storage, you could kind of lump into one or a combination of these different applications. I mean, there may be some very specific niche applications that would be added here, but I think this list kind of subsumes everything. So to go through it very quickly, energy arbitrage, this figure here kind of demonstrates the idea. So the red curve here is historical wholesale market price data from PJM, which is one of our wholesale markets in the eastern United States. And the price axis is on the right-hand side of this figure here. And so if you know what these prices are, well, you can make money from buying low, selling high. That's essentially what the blue bars indicate. So nothing all that complicated. If you're in a vertically integrated utility setting as opposed to a wholesale market setting, you could do the same thing. It would be based on the marginal generation cost of the incumbent utility, not on wholesale prices that are coming out of a market. Capacity deferral. So basically what you're doing is you're storing energy when you have a capacity constraint that is slack, and then you're discharging stored energy to alleviate a binding capacity constraint. So you can do that to alleviate generation capacity. So instead of building a peaking plant, you can build and this is what we did in the US in the 1970s, you can build pumped hydroelectric storage. You charge in the middle of the night using coal or nuclear, whatever your base load generation is. You discharge it in the afternoon. It alleviates the need to build a peaking plant. And then you can do the same with transmission and distribution deferral as well. So as an example, if you have a distribution feeder or distribution transformer that's overloaded, traditionally the wire solution is you replace the transformer, you upgrade the circuit, whatever it is. Well, you could build a battery on the constrained side of that link. You store the energy when the line is not loaded, and then you discharge it when it's loaded. Ancillary services, so there are lots of different ancillary service products. This figure here is illustrating what a frequency regulation signal looks like. And of course, the typical benefit of using energy storage for ancillary services is that if you get these services from generation, you have to partially load the generator because you're sort of reserving some capacity to provide ancillary services. And usually when you partially load a generator, it doesn't operate as efficiently, so there's some implicit cost associated with that. Energy storage, by and large, doesn't suffer from those types of efficiency hits when you use them for frequency regulation, spinning reserves, other types of contingency reserves, so on and so forth. And then finally, there are lots of things that end users could potentially want to use energy storage for, or that utilities might want to use for their end users. So as an example, retail customers that pay time-varying prices, or if they're subject to demand charges, they might benefit from using energy storage to basically do retail tariff management. And then in some cases, individual customers, this is especially true of large industrial customers, sometimes they will use on-site energy storage systems to deal with power quality issues because their utility service doesn't necessarily provide the level of power quality that they want. Something else that utilities are starting to do is they have started to look at providing the service for their customers. So if there are distribution circuits where power quality is an issue or service reliability is an issue, they might put a distributed energy storage system on the distribution circuit to alleviate some of those service issues. Okay, so the next thing I kind of want to segue into is, so we have all these different things that we can potentially do with energy storage. So then, you know, a natural question is, well, what do we want to do given that we have lots of different options? And so this table is just taken from some illustrative case studies that a former student of mine did, but there's kind of this cottage industry where people look at this idea of value stacking or multi-use applications where you're potentially doing different things at the same time. And so in some of these cases here, so if we look at, let's say, the third row of this table, what we're doing is, you know, most days we're using the energy storage for energy arbitrage. So we're buying electricity when it's cheap, we're selling it when it's expensive, and we make some money off of doing that. But we also, in this particular case, the battery is located in a circuit where there are overload conditions on the distribution feeder, and so we are, you know, on some days we're using some of that stored energy to alleviate that distribution circuit bottleneck, and so that's why the arbitrage profit that we earn in the third row is a little bit lower than the rows above. So we're foregoing a little bit of arbitrage revenue, but the amount of avoided load curtailment far outweighs the loss of revenue from arbitrage when we compare the third and the first row to one another, as an example. So, and this is not by any means a comprehensive case study where we've looked at every single combination of applications. The point of this is just to illustrate that given how expensive most storage technologies are, if you really want to make them economically viable, you need to be smart about bundling different potential uses together. So it's not always, but it's typically difficult to justify building a storage asset for doing just a single application. There are cases that you can, but by and large, those are, I'd say, more the exception than the rule. Okay. So sort of given this background, why is it that, so where does my claim come from that energy storage is incompatible with regulatory and market design practice? And where it comes from is basically, if you look in the United States, and this is true, I think, in most parts of the world that have restructured their markets, you have essentially a hybrid market design. So you have a mixture of some services that are market priced or market contingent, and some services that are still essentially under, it's typically something akin to cost of service regulation. So kind of these top two boxes here, this is generally true in the United States. So in most of our restructured markets, energy and ancillary services, these are market contingent, market priced products. In the Eastern ISOs and RTOs, so in PJM, New York, New England, we actually have explicit capacity auctions. So capacity is an actual, generation capacity is an actual market contingent service. And then the things on the right, transmission capacity, distribution capacity, service reliability, these are examples of services that are by and large still subject to cost of service regulation. So where I live in Ohio, my distribution utility, AEP, basically builds and maintains the distribution infrastructure. It basically gets a regulatory franchise from the Public Utility Commission of Ohio, and it basically passes the cost of that on to me as a ratepayer through what we would call rate-based cost recovery. So what the bottom box here says that sort of, puts this together is that different assets historically have been treated differently from a regulatory and from a cost recovery perspective. So for instance, in PJM, if you want to build a generator, there are a few states within PJM that are an exception to this, but by and large, the way that you do that is you have to recover your investment costs by selling energy ancillary services and capacity in the wholesale market. So there's no kind of guaranteed customer-funded cost recovery mechanism in most of the PJM footprint. On the other hand, if you want to build, so I gave the example of my local utility, if AEP needs to build a new distribution transformer, it basically gets cost recovery authorization from the Public Utility Commission of Ohio, and so it's able to pass that cost on to me as a ratepayer. It gets rate-based cost recovery. And so this has always worked because historically generators are different than distribution wires, right? The problem when we go back to that list of different applications or different services that energy storage can provide is we have a mix now of market contingent and services that are regulated. And so if I come back to this table that I showed you before, where we were doing this, where we were potentially doing this value stacking thing, well, if we look at the third row of the table, the obvious question to ask is, would what we modeled in the third row of this table actually be legal, given our regulatory and market designs? And so the answer to that question is it differs a little bit on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. The best example that I'll give is the example of the state of Texas. So a few years ago, one of the transmission and distribution utilities in Texas, it was called Encore, it had a proposal to build about 5 gigawatts of distributed batteries across its service territory. Now, state law in Texas bars transmission and distribution utilities. This is an explicit legal bar from owning any assets that participate or are contingent in the wholesale market. And in some sense, I think this is a good idea from the perspective of price formation, especially in a place like Texas where you have an energy-only market. Because T&D utilities, by virtue of the fact that they are getting rate-based cost recovery, if they are owning assets that participate in the wholesale market, that can potentially have deleterious scarcity pricing, so on and so forth. And so that means that that could hamper generation investment because generators that have to recover their costs through the market are all of a sudden competing with assets that are getting essentially customer-funded cost recovery, customer-funded, you could view it as a subsidy. This price formation issue, I'd say, is not as big of a deal in the other ISO and RTO markets in the US. That's because all the other ones have either explicit capacity mechanisms or there's an actual regulatory body that basically requires utilities to either build capacity themselves or contract with third parties to build generation capacity. So I argue it's not as big of an issue there just by virtue of the fact that there's sort of this regulatory backstop to get generation capacity built. But in a place like Texas or a place like Australia, where you're relying on the energy market only and you're relying on scarcity pricing to get capacity built, this is, I think, this is an important issue. So basically, as a result of this, basically Encore ended up at an impasse, and the impasse was that if they were going to build these 5 gigawatts of batteries just to provide distribution deferral and voltage support benefits, so these are regulated services, there's no market participation issue there, so the state law would not really be an issue. They really couldn't justify the investment cost. So the cost savings from the distribution deferral wasn't enough to pay for the batteries. So basically, as the last bullet there says, the only way that Encore really was able to pitch or sell this proposal was they said, if we could extract this distribution deferral benefit, but then, on some days, depending on what wholesale prices look like, we do energy arbitrage or we provide frequency regulation. So if we kind of if we add those two revenue streams together, then we're in the money, right? And so the problem is that we don't really have a kind of market design that allows us to do this. And so here, really, this kind of, I think, summarizes sort of the two parts of the issue. So on one hand, we want a way to be able to combine market contingent and unpriced or regulated value streams. So we want to be able to do something like what Encore proposed, but we don't want to harm price formation through rate-based or customer-subsidized storage assets participating in the wholesale market. So we kind of need to, we kind of want to combine these two value streams, but we need to like separate them in a way that the wholesale market is able to function the way that we want it to. Okay, so this brings me to kind of the last thing that I'm going to talk about, which is this this proposal. And again, I don't want to pitch this as the only potential solution to this problem, but it's something that that we looked at. This idea of using storage capacity rights. So this figure here, which is quite messy, is kind of meant to illustrate the idea here. So in the upper right, where it says ES, so that basically represents your energy storage assets. So it could be a battery or whatever other storage device that you have. And then towards the bottom, you have these ovals with different potential energy storage users. So the idea here is that you have someone who builds, let's say it's a battery, and then you have all these different third parties, and the different third parties want to use that energy storage for different potential applications. And I'll give an example, a concrete example of this in a moment. And so what you do, that rounded rectangle between the energy storage and the users, you essentially have an auction, and the auction is where you basically allocate capacity or you allocate rights to use the energy storage to the different third parties. And then at the bottom, the energy storage users who are buying and paying for these capacity rights, these rights to use the storage, well, they have to recover the cost of the rights that they obtain. And so depending on what they're doing, they can either do that through the wholesale market, if they're using the storage for market contingent applications, or they can do it through regulatory rate base if they're using storage for a service or an application that is kind of under cost of service regulation. So, so here is just kind of 3 bullets that summarize what I said, and the middle bullet is where I sort of give 2 examples of 2 different potential third-party users. So this is not an exhaustive list, but it's just 2 illustrative examples. So you could, as one example, have a wind generator that wants to use the storage to shift wind production to a higher price period. So it's producing wind at 2 in the morning, it wants to shift it to 2 in the afternoon. So it basically wants the right to inject energy into storage at 2 in the morning and then withdraw it at 2 in the afternoon. That's what it wants. And then as another example, I could have a transmission and distribution utility that wants to buy storage capacity for purposes of service reliability for its customers. And so, it would have a different potential use of the energy storage. And so in the first case of the wind generator, if it manages to buy or obtain some of these storage rights in the auction, it recovers the cost through its wholesale transactions. The transmission and distribution utility, because it's providing a regulated service, presumably goes to the state regulatory authority and basically gets rate-based cost recovery. Okay. So then the next question becomes, how do you actually define storage capacity rights? And so, as I say here, to a first order approximation, so kind of there's more hand waving that I'm doing that I have written here, but kind of the two important things that we're ignoring. One is we're ignoring device degradation, and the second is we're ignoring nonlinearities. So we're assuming basically that you can model the energy storage kind of evolution of state of charge as being linear. I'll show you what I mean when I show you what the auction model looks like in a moment. But if we ignore some of these complicating factors, then basically the use of storage has two governing constraints. One is that a storage device normally has a power constraint, and it also has an energy constraint. So power constraint basically means there's a limit on how much you can charge or discharge at any instant in time. So I might only be able to charge at most 1 megawatt. So that means that if my transmission and distribution utility wants to charge, let's say 0.7 megawatts into the battery, and I allocate 0.7 megawatts of charging capacity to the T&D utility, that means I only have 0.3 megawatts available to potentially allocate to the wind generator, right? Now, ultimately, the two of them are going to be competing with each other, because what the two of them are going to do is they submit bids to the auction saying, I'm willing to pay X dollars to inject energy, I'm willing to pay Y dollars to inject energy, and the auctioneer basically determines who to give these rights to maximize the value of the capacity portfolio that it allocates. Okay, so we kind of have these two types of constraints, power and energy constraints, that govern the use of energy storage. And then the other complicating factor to keep in mind is that depending on how someone is intending to use energy storage, different uses could impact either the power constraints only, or it could impact the power and the energy constraints. Okay? So again, going back to the two examples that I gave before, this kind of illustrates what I mean here. So in the first case of the wind generator, the example that I gave was the wind generator wants to inject energy at 2 in the morning, and it wants to withdraw it at 2 in the afternoon. And that's all it cares about. So it doesn't care what happens to those megawatt hours between 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. It just wants to inject and it wants to withdraw. So in the case of the wind generator's use of energy storage, it's only really going to impact the power constraints. So you just have to make sure when it's injecting at 2 in the morning, you don't over-inject, and when it's withdrawing at 2 in the afternoon, you're not over-withdrawing. What happens to the megawatt hours between 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, we don't really care about. Now, in the case of the transmission and distribution utility, so the T&D utility wants to put energy into storage, and it wants to keep the energy in the storage. And the reason it wants to keep the energy in the storage is because it wants that energy available in case there is a service reliability issue, so that it can keep its customers' lights on. So in this case, the transmission and distribution utility, its intended use of the energy storage impacts both the power constraints and the energy constraints. And so as a result of this, sort of based on this observation, now again, this is not the only way to define storage capacity rights, but this is the abstraction that we used in our analysis. So we basically define two types of storage capacity rights. One are what we call power capacity rights. What these do, and the wind generator in the example that I gave would be interested in these. So power capacity rights basically entitle the holder to inject energy into or withdraw energy from storage at a given point in time. Those rights don't tell you anything about what happens to those megawatt hours between the time of injection and withdrawal. So someone else could withdraw some of that energy between your injection and withdrawal time. And then the second type of right, which our transmission and distribution utility would be interested in, entitles the holder to inject energy into storage, keep it for a certain amount of time in the storage, and then withdraw it. So here, this is for someone that wants to make sure that those megawatt hours actually stay in the battery within some window of time. And so this again, complicated figure kind of illustrates the idea of how these different types of storage capacity rights work. So on the left-hand side, you can think of, we're keeping track of the state of charge of the battery. And then the three kind of columns on the right-hand side of this figure. So the first one is showing charging power capacity rights that are being allocated. So when you allocate those, what you're basically saying is that some energy will be charged into the battery, so the state of charge goes up. The middle of those three columns show discharging power capacity rights. When you allocate those, that means you're taking energy out of storage. And then the column on the very right-hand side is showing you, I call it a point-to-point as an example. I term it a point-to-point energy right, but what you're basically doing is you're coupling a injection and withdrawal of energy with keeping that energy in the storage between the point of injection and withdrawal. Okay? All right. So this is the one. Given that I need to pretend to be an engineer, so I need one slide with some mathematics on it to kind of convince you that we did actually do some math, not just a fluffy proposal here. So this is an illustration of what the auction model looks like. So just to walk through it really quickly, the objective function, what it's doing is it's basically maximizing the value of the portfolio of rights that you allocate. So the first term is basically, those are the pi with the D and the pi with the C superscript. Those are basically bids or offers that the third party submits saying, what am I willing to pay for a discharging or a charging power capacity right? So I collect from all the different third parties what their willingness to pay is for these rights. Those are the pies. And then what I, as the auctioneer, determine is how many rights to give everyone. Those are the Qs. So I multiply everyone's willingness to pay by what I give them. That gives me essentially what the stated value of the portfolio is. And then the second term in the objective function, that basically represents these point-to-point, these energy capacity rights. So same thing there. People submit their bids, their pies, telling me what they're willing to pay for these energy capacity rights. And then I have another set of Qs that represent how many of those I allocate. Okay? And then when we look down at the constraints, so the three main constraints, the first three, I'll go through in detail. The last three are basically just each right that you allocate has to be non-negative, so you're not going to give everyone a negative right allocation. And then the upper bound is basically, well, each person tells me, so someone might tell me I'm willing to pay $10 per megawatt to inject up to 5 megawatts. So the upper bound is also part of the bid or part of the offer that each third party submits. So the first three constraints, what the first one is giving you, the first one is just giving us, it's basically tracking what the state of charge of the battery is going to be time step per time step, hour by hour, depending on whatever the temporal resolution of our auction model is. So this is what I said before. I'm assuming that we have state of charge that evolves linearly. We're not taking into account nonlinearities in charging and discharging characteristics. So if we did, then this first constraint here would look more complicated because we'd have to take into account nonlinearities in the evolution of the state of charge. So that first constraint is just a very standard, if you've done any energy storage modeling, just a, state of charge at time t is state of charge at time t minus 1, so whatever the previous state of charge is, plus what you add from injecting energy. And you can either inject energy from allocating charging power rights or from allocating energy rights, because both of those encompass injection of energy into the storage. And then we subtract from that what we take out. Well, you take out energy when you allocate a discharging capacity right, and then you also take out energy when that energy capacity right hits its discharge period. The second constraint there, so that is just, the second constraint is basically your upper and lower limits on the state of charge of the battery. The upper limit is very straightforward. It's just whatever the energy carrying capacity of the storage is. The lower limit is a little bit different. So the lower limit, what it's taken into account is when I've allocated these energy capacity rights, I basically, so if I allocate, let's say 5 megawatts of energy capacity right to someone, I'm saying between the point of injection and the point of withdrawal, there will be 5 megawatt hours of energy in the battery. And so that's why on the left-hand side of this state of charge constraint, we have the energy capacity rights that we've allocated. That's why they show up on the left-hand side. And then finally, the third constraint here, this is your power capacity constraint. So what you're doing is you're looking at all of the net injections, or you're looking at all the injections minus all the withdrawals at any point in time. That has to be within whatever the power constraints of the device are. Okay? And then last thing that I'll note here, so those first three constraints, I put in parentheses Lagrange multipliers or dual variables. And the reason that I put these here is because, and this is where, so this mathematics I've hidden, but so using a little bit of light duality theory, you can basically come up with efficient pricing rules for the rights that you allocate. And those pricing rules come from these Lagrange multipliers here. Okay? And the thing that I note here in the third bullet is the pricing rules are, they are analogous to the way that we do locational marginal pricing in the United States. So in locational marginal pricing, basically, to summarize, the price of electricity at any bus in the network is equal to system marginal price plus congestion rent plus transmission losses. So we have something very similar here. Basically, the lambdas give us, the lambdas are analogous to system marginal price of energy, and then the sigmas and the gammas, these represent essentially congestion cost. And congestion here arises not from saturating the carrying capacity of the transmission line. Congestion arises when you saturate either the energy or the power capacity of the storage device. But I think it's nice from the perspective that, you know, we in the United States have had close to 30 years of experience with locational marginal pricing, and given that we're doing something analogous to it here, you know, hopefully it's not like a huge mental leap in terms of doing something completely brand new. There's some properties that you can show as far as the allocation is concerned. So first, the allocation and prices are equilibrium supporting. They're equilibrium supporting in the sense that if all your third parties are behaving competitively, they're all happy with the allocation that they get and the prices that they have to pay. Of course, we're neglecting exercise of market power, which is a real, I mean, it is an issue, but this is sort of analogous to a result that we have in locational marginal pricing and congestion management. And then the second nice property is that you can show that the storage device owner always earns non-negative revenues from the allocation of the capacity rights. And on top of that, you can actually show through again, it's a duality argument, you can show that the net revenues that are earned by the storage device owner equals the imputed marginal value of the storage device. So in other words, you are getting the correct signal you're getting the correct incentives for capacity investment, because the revenue is exactly equal to what your third parties place as marginal value on the storage device. Okay, just last thing to go through very quickly. So there are some important implementation details here. So one is who runs the auction. Now the nice thing about mathematics is that mathematics is agnostic to who runs the auction, so anyone could be the auctioneer. One natural choice could be that your system or your market operator does this. So just for some context on this, in the United States, about 10 years ago, we had a number of cases of developers wanting to build energy storage that was going to participate in the wholesale market, and the market operators all essentially across the board said they don't want to operate the energy storage, and they came up with some very strange reasons for not wanting to do it, which I could go into later if someone is interested. I think now with Order 841, it's a FERC order that's requiring all of the market operators in the US to come up with, they have to come up with market participation rules for energy storage to participate in the wholesale markets. I think the pendulum is probably going to swing in the opposite direction. I think the market operators are going to want to have more control over what energy storage in their systems are doing. But again, it remains to be seen how exactly that's going to work out. I think another important implementation detail is what the timing of the auction looks like, and that builds into long-term contracting. So the reason the timing of the auction is important, so if I go back to some of the purported possible uses of energy storage. So as an example, if you want to use distributed energy storage to alleviate a distribution constraint, your T&D utility, my guess is not going to want to go to a spot market, in real time or day ahead to buy storage capacity. So in all likelihood, the way that this would work is you would have a T&D utility basically signing a long-term contract with a storage owner, and the price at which that contract trades would in some sense bake in what the expected cost of these capacity rights are going to be. But you can do that long-term contracting on top of a spot, a day ahead or a real-time spot market. We do that in the US with power purchase agreements. I know you do that here with power purchase agreements and other types of swap and option contracts for generators. So you should be able to do something similar even if the auction itself runs on a day ahead or on a real-time basis. So final thing here, just to conclude, this kind of summarizes what I've been going through. So really, I think the other maybe potentially interesting point to add is this fourth bullet here, which is that so some of these services that are currently regulated, so they're not market contingent. One of the reasons that we do this is because some of these services are, so I'll give voltage control as a good example. So voltage control, you typically have essentially a locational monopoly at different buses in the network because reactive power doesn't travel the way that real power does. And so to do voltage control at a particular bus in the network, there may really only be a single supplier that could provide it. And so if you have a single supplier, you have a locational monopoly, making that a market contingent service, you kind of know what the prices would look like in that situation. So if you're able to move to a world in which you have more of these distributed energy resources that can provide these services, that could basically give you enough competing assets that you could at some point have a market that actually produces prices for VARs, which we don't have today. There's this group at Boston University, Michael Karamanis and some of his colleagues, who've been looking at this concept of doing distribution level locational marginal pricing, where they're doing pricing of real and reactive power at the distribution level. So it's sort of taken this idea to next level, I suppose. These are just a few things that I referenced, and with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Ramteen. Questions? Yeah, Nick.
I've got a couple of questions. Oh, I guess it's just really fascinating. Really, yeah, really, really cool. Yeah. My questions are, with this, like, buying an energy right for a line to, like, defer line upgrading or manage congestion, you buy the right, but you don't necessarily know if the energy actually gets used or not. And so for the longer term rights after that one, we don't know what the state of the battery will be. And how does that affect, or how does the auction cope with this uncertainty?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So so what I would say is, you know, if you're able to develop the spot market, and then you kind of have people doing long-term contracting on top of that. So my vision is that you could, you know, let's say a T&D utility wants to use distributed energy storage to alleviate a distribution constraint. So it could purchase rights for, you know, multiple years, and it may over-procure the amount of storage capacity that it actually needs. And so what that means is then when you run this auction day ahead or real time or at whatever time point, if your transmission and distribution utility is over-procured capacity on a long-term basis, it could presumably resell what it doesn't need in the spot market.
That would be a big part of the efficiency advantage, would be to have that trading around your positions as things change. Eh?
And conversely, if it's under procured, I mean, in theory, it can go into the spot market and buy more capacity as well. So, and I should, so kind of some additional context on this. So when Oncor, that transmission and distribution utility in Texas, so they tried a couple of ways to get around the state law that basically prevented them from owning batteries that participate in the market. So one, which is of course the obvious one, is you just lobby enough legislators to get them to change the law. But apparently their lobbying efforts weren't successful because the legislative term ended and the legislation that they were pushing didn't advance. But the other thing that they proposed, so they proposed something similar to this. Their proposal was basically that they would get so they would basically build the batteries, the 5 gigawatts. And they basically said, so I don't remember the exact number, but they said, well, we think about 60% of the 5 gigawatts we'll need for distribution deferral. We'll do rate-based cost recovery of that. And then the other 40% we will bid into the market. So in some sense, they're doing something akin to this. They're kind of, you know, they're kind of breaking the battery up into regulated versus market contingent services. My issue with their proposal is that they were basically saying up front 60-40 is the split between, you know, doing distribution deferral versus doing frequency regulation or energy arbitrage or whatever. And in all likelihood, 60-40 was not going to be the correct number. So this is in some sense supposed to kind of, it's supposed to, you can think of as supplement that idea, because you're now allowing the mix of different services to sort of, change dynamically based on what the third parties want to potentially use the storage for.
Just a quick question for anyone here on that. As I understand it, our network businesses, obviously there is the regulated, but they're also able to participate in a range of contestable services. Mm-hmm. So you might envisage potentially a similar model here where they'd go partially contestable, partially regulated asset base. Interesting question. We'll come back to you, Nick, but time.
Thanks, Professor, for the presentation. It was great. I've got a couple of questions about how this particular model takes into account locational benefits. So if a battery is located behind a generator meter, that can offer a lot of benefits to the generator, but it may not be able to defer and avoid network investment if it was embedded in the network. Does this take into account that depending on where the batteries are situated in the network, they can offer these different benefits? And I also have a follow-up question, but perhaps we'll go for this first.
Yeah. So in theory, depending on where a particular battery is located, you may find, so there may be a different mix of third parties that want to use the battery for different potential applications. The other thing that I'll add to this, so I think, at least to a first order approximation, that energy storage that's connected at the bulk transmission level, you don't really have this, in principle, you don't have the same type of issue because you should be able to basically give operational control of a bulk power system storage asset to the market operator or the ISO or RTO. It should, in theory, be in the best position to co-optimize the operation of that asset with all the other generation and transmission assets. The reason that doesn't work, at least in the present day with distributed energy storage, is that ISO and RTO markets don't model anything at the distribution level. So PJM's market model, as an example, it does not have the resolution to look at what's happening at the individual distribution feeder level. So something here like a transmission and distribution utility wanting to use a distributed battery for service reliability on a particular circuit, that just would not show up in the ISO's market. So it just that potential use wouldn't pop up in some sense.
Okay, thank you. And my other question was on sort of, maybe it's because I've misinterpreted or not fully understood how the model works, but are the rights exclusive, as in you've got the power rights and the energy rights? I imagine a network and a generator would both want to use that battery to discharge at the same time. Does one win out, or do they both get rights to use it at the same time?
No. So you can certainly, the way that the auction model is set up, you could have a mixture of power and energy rights allocated at the same time. So it's not like only one has to be allocated or only the other. You certainly could have third parties who want a mix of the two. And then the other thing to stress, so the way that I've defined these rights here, this is not the only way to do it. So basically, I defined it this way because it made the mathematics relatively simple. There certainly are other ways, and other ways that I've thought about that these rights could be defined that would have different characteristics compared to what we modeled here.
Yeah, my suspicion is, the energy right's the power right plus more, basically.
Yeah.
And given price volatility in Australia, you'd almost imagine being able to do something at a certain time is obviously less valuable than being able to do something at the time when the pricing says that's the opportunity.
Right. So just as an example, so the way that I've defined the energy capacity right here, so you have to specify time of injection, time of withdrawal, and the volume, right? Now, you could easily write this as instead of fixed time of injection and fixed time of withdrawal, you could define it as more of an option, which is fixed time of injection, and then you can withdraw at any time up to this point here. If you do that, then basically these constraints are going to change because now you have to take into account, you know, when those options are exercised. And so this becomes a little bit more, it's not impossible, but it just becomes a little bit messier, and then the pricing rules become a little bit messier. But, you know, I think a similar type of result will still carry through because basically kind of duality theory will still give us the same types of properties that we have from this relatively simple version of the model.
Nick, I think you had a second question, is that right?
Yeah, when a network or someone in the regulated side withdraws the energy, what's the effect on the wholesale market?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, fundamentally when you charge or discharge energy, assuming the volume is large enough, it is going to move wholesale prices.
And does that still have the original problem of destroying price creation in the wholesale market?
It's a good question. I would need to think about it a little bit. On the surface, I don't think so, but I would need to give it a little bit more thought just to give you a complete answer to that.
Please feel free to jump in and correct me, but my understanding is certainly when our networks have generation assets they run to avoid blackouts or something behind constrained elements of the network, there is this issue about you're not meant to be changing market outcomes and pricing when you do that. And that's actually a key test because otherwise, yeah, it can certainly interact across. That sound right? Friends Trust?
We'll take you in for it.
Okay.
Something like that.
Other questions or thoughts? Yeah. Question for you, just thinking about the Australian context. Clearly you could have a network business here basically offer a storage project that they would provide a revenue stream for a network service coming from this, and then within the constraints of that network service, which might be time constrained, it's summer peak or something like that, for the rest of the time you can do with the storage what you will. I mean, we could envisage that being allowed, right? So it's a private project owner, some revenue from a network service that they've got a side contract with, and then within that constraint operating within the market. It sounds like that would be allowed in Texas, if I've understood it.
So in Texas, I guess I'd have to. So I'm not a lawyer, so I definitely couldn't give you legal advice. But I guess I'd have to just kind of go through the nitty-gritty details a little bit more. So California is the other. I think California is the other case that is. It's useful to look at from the perspective that California has this storage mandate. And so the storage mandate, for those of you who are not familiar, the Public Utility Commission of California is basically has a requirement in place for each of the 3 investor-owned utilities to build or contract a certain amount, and I don't remember I think it's 2 or 3 gigawatts of energy storage across the state, and some of it is required to be behind the meter or distribution level. So basically the Public Utility Commission has kind of created this issue where you have distribution level storage assets that are coming in. And from what I understand, because it's kind of hard to get concrete answers to this, but from what I understand, in California, they are basically allowing those assets to participate in the wholesale market if the utility wants to participate them into the market. And from what I understand, again, basically whatever revenue is earned in the market just offsets what gets passed on to ratepayers. So that's sort of been their answer there. Now I'm not totally convinced that if you are an investor-owned utility in California, I'm not convinced that that takes away the incentive to potentially use the storage in a way to suppress scarcity prices. I mean, you can actually show somewhat. You can show at least in a stylized model that if you are a utility with a large load service obligation, it's actually beneficial for you to operate the storage in a money-losing way, because the price suppression effect, when you multiply it by the volume of load that you have to serve, that cost savings kind of outweighs the money that you lose from overrunning the energy storage. Of course, you have to have a sufficiently large volume that you can actually move the price, but you can show that incentive exists for a utility with a large enough load obligation.
I think we see some parallels with the gentailers here, where they will play off losses on one side of the business against wins on the other. That's an interesting storage parallel there, actually, with both. Any other questions before we wrap it up? We are a little over time. Okay, well, we're not running off, so if you do have any questions, just come and we'll be hanging out outside. In fact, I think we can probably hang out in here if you've got any questions. This is going up on the Spree seminar website, and the slides obviously will be available there along with the recording, so thank you, Rob. And please join me again in thanking Ramteen.